In the name of Emmanuel, God with us. Amen. Happy New Year. Yes, it is a new year. Advent 1, year B. Gospel of Mark. You open the gospel book and there's a beautiful clean page and a big New Year sign. Earlier this week, I was talking to a 12-year-old I often speak with, and boring her, I'm sure, by talking about what I really wanted to preach this Sunday. And I said, you know what I really want to do? I want to get a chair, and I want to put it right there. And then I want to say to all of us, I wonder how quiet we can get. And then lead us in some breathing and silent meditation, just to allow the words, so many words of worship, to sink in. And she said, Mom, that is a terrible idea. Please don't do that. And I said, why? What's so terrible about being quiet? She's like, no one wants to be quiet. God gave us mouths so we can talk. And so we had this back and forth because I wanted to get to the essence of why we don't want to be quiet. Because she's speaking of real truth that I wrestle with myself. Why don't we want to be quiet and still? I think it's scary. I think when we do that, we have to confront that at the end of the day, I is all I have. I think we have to wrestle with the difference between loneliness and solitude. And I think that when we force ourselves maybe to do it, we also have to wrestle with this endless monologue that is going on in our heads all the time, of which there are two tracks. One is constantly ruminating about the past, while the other is fixated on obsessing about the future. And when you apply any reason to this whatsoever, logically speaking, since there's nothing we can do about either one, it is a total exercise in futility. And yet, we give our thinking far more attention than we are present to our being. A few years ago, there was a play on Broadway, and I don't know anything about the play. It was the title that grabbed my attention. Now hear this. And maybe like you, when you heard that, your first thought of the title was, now hear this, H-E-A-R. But that's not the title. It's now, period, here, H-E-R-E, period, this, period. Advent 1, a new year. This new year, by the way, is a way less stressful time to make New Year's resolutions than that other one coming up. And this title has become a resolution of mine, a little bit of a mantra, a reset button when I become aware of that loop-de-loop in my head of futility, helping me just say, now, here, pay attention to the this that is right in front of me. You see, now is the acceptable time. Now is the day of our salvation. That's what Paul goes on to say to the Corinthians, because they are obsessing about the past and worrying about when Jesus is going to return. But before he gets there, as he's encouraging them to let that stuff go, he reminds them in what we just heard, you have everything you need. Speech of every kind, knowledge of every kind. Everything you need has already been given to you. In fact, you were called. And God is faithful, so there's nothing to worry about at all. It's that simple. A few Advent winters ago, I had a different car. And you know that thing that happens when it's really cold in the morning and your heat hasn't started up? So if you turn on your windshield wiper fluid and start wiping the windshields, you can get the frost off really quick. So 1 week, I'm trying to do that as I'm driving early in the morning, and it's not. I'm pulling the lever. I'm like, what's wrong with the fluid? I know it's been topped off. Why isn't it coming out? So I had to go into my mechanic, who's like a mom and pop kind of local mechanic, and I said to him, okay, when you change the oil, check this lever thing, because my windshield wiper fluid is not working. And I said this to him in a waiting room smaller than the size of this altar, and it was filled with people, so everybody heard me. So I sit there 30 minutes. He comes back in. He's like, okay, ma'am, there's your car. It's right there. He's like, you've had this car for a while, right? And I was like, yeah. I was like, so did you fix the wiper fluid thing, so the lever, so it works? And he's like, you see all the blue liquid on the snow? I said, yeah. He's like, there's nothing wrong with your fluid. It works just fine. And I said, excuse me, again, in front of all the people. I said, excuse me, I pull it back and forth and it's not coming up. He's like, oh, ma'am, that's because you have to push it. Just push the lever. He's like, you had this car for a while, right? I'm like, and that, wash of embarrassment. And so to try and lighten the mood, I just say, so are you going to charge me extra for that? Or is the shame and humiliation payment enough for what just transpired? He's like, yeah, we're good. We're good. So why am I sharing that story with you? Because in hindsight, that particular Advent, I was so lost in my head all the time. I was so ruminating about the past and so anxious about my future that there was no now or here or this. And when we're not present to our reality, it has consequences. And they can be meaningless consequences, like the embarrassment of forgetting how your car works, or they can be serious consequences, like in hindsight, recognizing missed opportunities, or lost time, or acknowledging apathy, because God was trying to break in and we were too blind to see it. Isaiah and the Psalm share a human struggle of this pleading with God to break in and make God's self known, even though apparently if God has to resort to that, it's going to be really terrifying. Mountains will quake and nations will tremble. Why do we want God to try and wrestle our attention from us? And so there's this confessional part where Isaiah says, I get that we're part of the problem. He writes very challenging truths. We have all become like one who is unclean. We have all transgressed. We have all sinned. In other words, we all forget about God's faithfulness to us. Another person I was reading this week, perhaps you know Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Any of you know that name, Bonhoeffer? I see some heads. Google it, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, incredible documentary about his life. He was a Lutheran theologian and scholar, and in the 1930s, he was teaching at Union Seminary in New York City, and people begged him to stay in the United States because he was one of the only Lutheran pastors speaking out against the Nazis. And he said, no, I cannot abandon my country and my people, and I will return home. And he did. And he's a theologian and pastor of incredible depth who made the decision to be part of a plot to assassinate Hitler. And it was not successful, obviously. And he was captured and spent the last few years of his life in a concentration camp where he inevitably died. And his writings in solitude and in pastoring to people in those prison camps are incredibly profound, huge influence on Dr. King, for instance. So he delivered a sermon on this day in 1928, long before all that World War II stuff. And he said this, maybe the celebration of Advent is possible only to those who are troubled in soul, who know themselves to be poor and imperfect, and to look forward to something greater to come. Perhaps we have thought so much about God as love eternal Perhaps we feel so much the warm pleasures of Christmas when he comes gently like a child, and we select only from that story the pleasant bits, that we forget the awesome nature of an event in which God of the universe, creator, sustainer, draws near to this little planet and speaks to us. The coming of God is not only a message of joy, but also fearful news for anyone who has a conscience. Despite our faults, Isaiah writes, you, God, made us. We are the clay, you are the potter, and we are all the work of your hand. Restore us, O Lord of hosts. Whatever we think about the incarnation, whatever belief we ascend to, is meaningless. It is how we incarnate. It is our very being of God that matters, how we bear the image now, here, in this and the next this that is in front of you. Are we allowing the potter to form us like clay now, here, and in this? May we simply open our hearts and our conscience to Emmanuel, God with us, and show the light of our countenance, for we are already saved. Amen.